It was the 13th of November, 1943, aboard the USS Essex in the Philippine Sea at 3:47 in the morning. An aviation machinist's mate, second class, named James Sweat, stood there watching yet another F6F Hellcat fighter plane tumble right off the carrier's deck and plunge into the dark waters of the Pacific Ocean. That marked the third pilot they'd lost that week alone. But these deaths weren't from battles with Japanese Zeros or blasts of anti-aircraft fire. No, they came from the plane's own fuel tanks bursting into flames during those tricky night landings on the carrier. The numbers were truly devastating. Ever since October, Task Force 38 had seen 47 Hellcat pilots perish due to these fuel vapor explosions while trying to recover on the carriers. Those self-sealing fuel tanks, which were meant to protect pilots from enemy bullets, were ironically turning against them and causing their deaths instead. Every single rough landing, every time the arresting hook snagged and jerked the plane to a stop, it sent a powerful shock right through the entire fuel system. That would ignite the vapor inside, and suddenly the cockpit would erupt into a blazing inferno before the pilot even had a chance to unbuckle their harness and escape. Admiral Mark Mitcher had no choice but to halt all nighttime operations completely. Without the ability to launch and recover fighters after dark, the whole carrier group was essentially defenseless once the sun went down. Japanese torpedo bombers were taking full advantage of this weakness. Just last week, the USS Independence had been hit by 2 torpedoes in a midnight raid, resulting in the loss of 73 sailors. The ship had barely limped its way back to Pearl Harbor for repairs. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics had been tackling this issue for a full 8 months by then. Their proposed fix involved strengthening the brackets that held the tanks in place, adding springs to dampen the vibrations, and tweaking the pressure release on the filler caps. But none of it was working. Pilots were still dying one after another, and the fuel tanks kept exploding without mercy. What the high-ranking admirals didn't realize, and what no one else knew at the time, was that a 24-year-old mechanic hailing from Terre Haute, Indiana, had been running his own secret experiments down in Hangar Bay 3. James Sweat hadn't even finished high school. He lacked any engineering degree or official training in designing fuel systems. Technically, he wasn't supposed to be coming up with ideas or solutions at all. His role was simply to follow commands, tighten bolts, and stay out of the way. But Sweat had been closely observing the investigations into these crashes. He'd been analyzing the patterns of the burns on the wreckage, and he'd spotted something crucial that all the engineers had overlooked entirely. It was something so straightforward, so basic, that when he eventually laid it out for the top brass, they would initially suspect him of deliberate sabotage. They'd even threaten to court-martial him right on the spot. They'd point out how his concept broke at least 3 key Navy rules and could land him 20 years behind bars in Leavenworth Prison. In just 3 hours from that moment, Sweat was about to sneak off with a Hellcat from the flight deck. He planned to conduct a completely unauthorized test flight right in the heart of an active combat area. And in doing so, he would demonstrate that the Navy's entire understanding of fuel tank safety was fundamentally flawed. The F6F Hellcat had come into service back in January of 1943, carrying with it a groundbreaking promise. It was set to be the very first fighter plane based on carriers that could withstand damage from battles and still get its pilots back safely. The key innovation lay in the self-sealing fuel tanks. If a bullet pierced the tank, a special layer of rubber inside would automatically close up the hole on its own. In contrast, the Japanese Zero fighters had nothing like that for protection. A single volley from a Hellcat's guns could ignite a Zero into a massive fireball. American pilots, however, could survive hits that would doom their opponents. By the summer of 1943, the Hellcat was ruling the skies over the Pacific. The ratios of kills were climbing as high as 19 to 1. Pilots absolutely adored the plane. It was speedy, packed with heavy weaponry, and almost unbeatable in close-quarters dogfights. The Navy went ahead and ordered 5,000 more of them. But then, the operations at night kicked in. Landings on carriers have always been a high-risk affair. Pilots often describe it as a controlled crash, where you're hurling a 20,000-pound machine onto a rolling, heaving deck at 90 knots, praying that the wire catches your tailhook just right. In the daylight, pilots can spot the landing signal officer, gauge their descent path, and make adjustments for how the carrier is shifting in the waves. But at night, they're essentially coming in without clear vision, relying solely on a handful of faint lights and instructions over the radio. The very first explosion in a fuel tank happened on the 3rd of October, 1943. Lieutenant Robert Anderson executed what seemed like a flawless night landing aboard the USS Lexington. His tailhook grabbed the number 3 wire perfectly, but that abrupt slowdown triggered a pressure surge through his fuel tanks. The vapor caught fire instantly. Anderson was gone before the firefighting team could even get close to him. The Navy pinned it on a mistake by the pilot. They figured Anderson must have approached too quickly or hit the deck too forcefully. So, they instructed all pilots to ease in more gently from then on. Then came the 14th of October, 1943. Ensign Charles Murphy met the same fiery end in an identical blast on the USS Bunker Hill. Murphy's approach had been spot on, and his speed matched the guidelines exactly. On the 22nd of October, it was Lieutenant James Fleming aboard the USS Enterprise. Same kind of explosion, same tragic outcome. By the 29th of October, 2 more pilots were lost in a single night. One on the USS Essex and another on the USS Yorktown. That's when the Bureau of Aeronautics called for an urgent probe into the matter. Their team of engineers pinpointed the issue. The sudden stop from the arresting wire was causing a kind of hydraulic hammer inside the fuel tanks. The fuel would rush forward with force, then bounce back. This built up a massive pressure that would split the self-sealing rubber layer. Vapor from the fuel would leak into the empty space above, and then any tiny spark, from static buildup, from parts rubbing together, or even from the plane's electrical setup, would set it all off. The Bureau came up with what appeared to be a sensible plan. Beef up the whole setup. Install tougher brackets to keep the tanks from moving around. Add springs that could soak up the jolts. Adjust the valves for pressure relief to let out the vapor more efficiently. They went ahead and updated 200 planes with these changes. But on the 6th of November 1943, the very first plane fitted with these new fixes exploded right during its landing. Lieutenant Richard Best was killed on the spot. The Admirals were in a state of panic by then. Admiral Mitcher decided to ground every night fighter mission until further notice. Without protection in the air after dark, the carrier groups were sitting ducks. Japanese subs had already taken out 2 destroyers. Torpedo planes were hitting them freely under the cover of night. Reports from intelligence suggested the Japanese were gathering their subs for a big synchronized assault on the carriers during the hours of darkness. The Navy's leading experts on fuel systems, folks with prestigious degrees from places like MIT and Caltech, were completely baffled. They'd thrown everything at it. More robust tanks, improved venting mechanisms, better ways to handle shocks. Nothing was making a difference. The general agreement was that self-sealing fuel tanks just couldn't work alongside night operations on carriers. The Navy would have to pick one and give up the other. But down in Hangar Bay 3 on the USS Essex, aviation machinist mate second class James Sweat wasn't buying into that conclusion at all. He'd been following along with the probes. He'd been poring over the damaged parts, and he believed everyone was focusing on the wrong aspect entirely. James Sweat had grown up repairing tractors on his family's farm in Indiana amid the hardships of the Great Depression. He had to leave school at 16 after his father passed away, stepping up to provide for his mother and his 3 younger sisters. He found work at an auto shop in Terre Haute, earning a local reputation as the young guy who could mend just about anything. When the attack on Pearl Harbor happened, Sweat signed up for the Navy the very next day. They didn't see him as pilot material though. No high school diploma meant he couldn't train as an officer. Instead, they assigned him to be a mechanic. Sweat didn't grumble about it. He thrived on working with planes. The F6F Hellcat was the most intricate piece of machinery he'd ever laid hands on. It had 9 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower, along with hydraulics, electrics, and armaments. He dove into every manual available and signed up for any training he could get. In just 6 months, he could take apart and put back together a Hellcat engine with his eyes closed. But Sweat went beyond just turning screws. He paid attention to how things broke down. While other mechanics might see a faulty component, Sweat spotted underlying trends. When the engineer suggested fixes, he would run mental simulations based on what he'd witnessed in actual use. On the night of the 12th of November 1943, Sweat was put on duty for investigating a crash. Lieutenant William Edwards had just perished in yet another fuel tank blast. Sweat went over the remains in the hangar bay. The tanks were split open in the exact same manner as all the previous ones. The brackets, now strengthened according to the Navy's latest updates, held firm. The damping springs showed no harm. The valves for pressure relief had operated as they should. Sweat gazed at those charred tanks for a solid 3 hours. Then, something caught his eye. The blast had started at the top of the tank, not down at the bottom. The way the burn spread showed the flames moving downward. But fuel is denser than air. It should settle low in the tank. If the hammering from the hydraulics was splashing fuel around and generating vapor, the fire ought to begin at the bottom, where the fuel and air would blend. Unless, of course, the real issue wasn't with the fuel itself. Sweat snatched a flashlight and squeezed into the wreckage to check the tank's inside. The rubber lining for self-sealing was fine at the bottom, but up near the filler cap at the top, the rubber was ripped to shreds. Not scorched from fire, but mechanically torn apart before any flames even started. That's when Sweat pieced it together. The engineers had been addressing the incorrect problem all along. The hydraulic hammer wasn't producing hazardous vapor by sloshing the liquid fuel around. Instead, it was generating a vacuum. When the plane came to that brutal halt, the fuel would lunge forward, creating an empty pocket at the tank's rear. Nature can't stand a vacuum, so air would rush in through the filler cap to occupy that space. But the flexible rubber lining, built to seal itself, would get pulled inward by the suction. It would rip, and that ripping would generate static electricity. That little spark would then ignite the fuel vapor that's always lingering in a tank that's not completely full. The Navy's attempts to reinforce things were actually making matters worse. Tougher tanks led to even more intense vacuum pulls. Improved valves for relief would expel vapor quicker, which in turn created stronger vacuums. Sweat figured out the solution, but he knew no one would take a high school dropout mechanic seriously. On the 13th of November, 1943, in Hangar Bay 3, Sweat couldn't get any rest. He kept replaying the image of Lieutenant Edwards trapped and burning in his cockpit. He mulled over the fix. It was so straightforward, so evident. Just occupy that empty area in the fuel tank with material that stops a vacuum from forming. Something neutral that doesn't catch fire. Something that can expand or contract along with the fuel amount. Foam rubber. If you placed open-cell foam rubber inside the tank, it would absorb the fuel like a sponge when the tank was topped off. As the fuel got used up in flight, the foam would let it out slowly. But crucially, the foam would fill up any vacant space. No vacancy means no vacuum. No vacuum means the self-sealing liner doesn't tear. No tear means no static spark. The foam might add about 5 pounds to each tank. It wouldn't hinder how the plane flew. No big changes to the structure would be needed. You could install it in under an hour. Sweat tracked down Chief Petty Officer Michael Torres in the maintenance office. Torres had been in naval aviation for 15 years. He had faith in Sweat's gut feelings. "Chief, I need some foam rubber, around 6 cubic feet, and access to a Hellcat's fuel setup." Torres eyed him. "What's this for?" "I understand why the tanks are blowing up, and I've got a way to stop it. The Bureau of Aeronautics has 50 engineers on this. What makes you think they've got it wrong?" "They're focusing on the wrong spot." Torres pondered it. He'd witnessed Sweat tackle tough issues before. "All right, show me what you've got." They labored through the night in a quiet corner of the hangar bay. Sweat laid out his vacuum idea. He pointed out the burn marks from the crash reports. He even demonstrated with a simple bucket of water and a sheet of rubber, illustrating how the suction rips the material. Torres became a believer. "We have to put this to the test. I need a Hellcat, and I need to simulate a full-speed arrested landing." "That's not feasible. We can't grab a plane without clearance." "Then who do we ask? The air boss? The captain? They dismiss us outright. You're just a machinist's mate, second class, not even close to being an engineer." Sweat knew Torres was spot on. The Navy ran on strict ranks. Ideas came from above, not below. An enlisted guy like him wasn't supposed to school admirals on fuel designs. "What if we go ahead anyway?" Sweat whispered. "Go ahead with what?" "Borrow a Hellcat tonight, add the foam. Do a test landing. If it succeeds, we've got evidence. If not, I'll face the court-martial alone." Torres stared hard. "That's flat out against the law. You'd be stealing government property, a naval fighter. That's 20 years in Leavenworth, maybe even execution by firing squad. How many more pilots have to burn while we chase approvals?" Torres recalled Lieutenant Edwards, the 73 sailors lost on the Independence, and the Japanese subs lurking around the carrier group, biding their time until nightfall. "Fine, I'll source the foam rubber," Torres said. "You prep the Hellcat. We test at first light." On the 13th of November 1943, Sweat and Torres hustled in the dim hours before dawn. They picked Hellcat number 42, a backup plane not lined up for the morning's flights. Using foam from the ship's mattresses, cut into long pieces and treated to resist fire, they lined the insides of both fuel tanks. The whole job took 40 minutes. They skipped any tests on the ground. No time for figuring out equations. They scarcely managed to seal the panels before the day's flight activities started ramping up. "I'll take the controls," Torres offered. "No, this is my brainchild, my risk." "But you're no pilot." "I've logged 30 hours in the co-pilot spot. I can handle a landing." Torres recognized the madness of it all, but time was slipping away. "Keep it brief. One landing, then we report this to the captain." Sweat settled into the cockpit. The crew on the flight deck was gearing up for the morning shifts. Amid all the shuffling of planes, one extra Hellcat moving toward the catapult blended right in. Sweat's pulse was racing. He'd never taken off from a carrier, never brought one down on deck. He was on the verge of trying the riskiest move in all of naval flying, with a fuel tweak that had zero official approval. The officer for the catapult signaled him ahead. Sweat positioned for launch. The team attached the holdback. From memory, he went through the steps. Flaps lowered, mixture set rich, propeller pitched full forward, canopy secured. The catapult launched. The force pinned Sweat against his seat. 3 seconds passed and he was soaring, pulling away from the Essex at 200 knots. For 10 minutes, Sweat looped around the carrier formation. He used up some fuel, dropping the tanks to half capacity, the level that had triggered so many blasts before. His hands trembled. In the past hour, he'd broken at least 6 rules worthy of a court-martial. If this failed, his time in the Navy was done. He set up for the landing path. The signal officer directed him. Sweat reduced throttle, extended flaps, fine-tuned his descent. The deck loomed closer. His wheels hit hard. The tailhook snared the number 2 wire. The stop was brutal, from 90 knots to 0 in 2 seconds. Sweat sensed the fuel shifting forward in the tanks. He braced for the blast. But nothing came. He was still breathing. The tanks held. The foam had done its job. Sweat rode to the parking zone and powered down. As he stepped from the cockpit, he spotted Commander David McCampbell, the commander of the air group, marching over the deck with 6 officers trailing him. McCampbell's face was flushed with fury. "What in the world do you think you're up to?" The showdown unfolded right on the flight deck, with 200 sailors as witnesses. "Sir, let me explain." "Explain? You took a naval plane without permission. You ran an unsanctioned flight. You put this whole carrier group at risk." Torres jumped in. "Sir, if you just hear us out, I'll lock you both up in minutes." The area exploded with voices. Officers yelled. The deck team paused their tasks to stare. Someone summoned the master at arms. Sweat attempted to describe the foam, the vacuum explanation, but McCampbell brushed it off. Then Captain Ralph Waller, who commanded the Essex, showed up on deck. "Commander McCampbell, what's going on here?" McCampbell summed it up. "Unauthorized takeoff, stolen fighter, breach of roughly 40 Navy codes." Waller faced Sweat. "Why did you do this?" Sweat poured out the details. The theory on vacuums, the shredded rubber, the foam as a remedy, and the just completed test landing that went perfectly. The deck fell quiet. Waller eyed the Hellcat. "You altered the fuel tanks?" "Yes, sir." "Without any approval?" "Yes, sir." "And you pulled off a high-speed arrested landing with tanks at half full?" "Yes, sir." Waller approached the plane. He checked the access panels for the tanks. He brought over the ship's engineer. Together, they looked at how the foam was placed. 5 minutes on, Waller turned to Sweat. "Machinists mate Sweat. You're either headed for jail or you're about to rescue this entire fleet. We're going to see which it is. Commander McCampbell, halt all flights. Get the Bureau of Aeronautics on the line and prepare 10 more Hellcats for the same changes." If stories like this grab you, tales of everyday folks who shifted the course of history with their bravery and clever thinking, think about subscribing to Last Words. We share the hidden accounts of heroes who wouldn't take impossible for an answer. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you catch every new episode. The Bureau of Aeronautics got back within hours. The message from Captain Ralph Waller about an enlisted mechanic possibly cracking the fuel tank explosion riddle made its way to Admiral John McCain, who led Task Force 38. McCain demanded tests right away. On the 14th of November, 1943, the USS Essex ran supervised trials. 6 Hellcats got the foam lining in their fuel tanks. 6 others stayed with the original setup as controls. Every plane went through 10 arrested landings, varying the fuel amounts, the speeds of approach, and the conditions of the sea. The pilots tested the boundaries: rough touchdowns, hooks catching off center, the hardest possible stops. The outcomes were undeniable. Not a single explosion in the foam-equipped planes, but 2 blasts in the unmodified group. Still, the Navy's higher-ups remained doubtful. Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman, in charge of developing carrier aviation, flew out to the Essex himself to question Sweat. "So you're claiming that 50 engineers from MIT overlooked what a farm kid from Indiana spotted?" "I'm no engineer, sir. Maybe that's the key. I wasn't buried in formulas. I was examining the actual debris." Sherman reviewed the trial results. He spoke with the pilots who flew the tests. He scrutinized the foam setup. At last, he posed the critical query. What's the effect on operations? The added weight, the flying performance, the upkeep? Sweat had his responses prepared. 5 pounds for each tank, barely noticeable. No drop in performance from the flight trials. It takes 45 minutes to install per plane. Materials cost $8. Sherman reached this verdict. We're rolling this out across the fleet. Every Hellcat in the Pacific gets updated in 2 weeks. But there was a hitch. The Navy lacked sufficient foam rubber. The stuff was scarce, mostly allocated for life vests and buoyancy equipment. Sherman pulled in every bit of compatible foam from the Pacific region. It fell short. Then came the idea of using mattresses. Each vessel had hundreds of them. The foam within, if coated with fire-resistant treatment, could serve. In 72 hours, sailors throughout the Pacific Fleet were slicing open mattresses. They slept on bare metal coils while their mattress foam went toward preserving pilots' lives. No one griped. Everyone had lost a friend or knew someone claimed by a fuel tank blast. This update became the quickest overhaul of aircraft in the annals of the Navy. By the 30th of November 1943, more than 800 Hellcats featured foam-lined fuel tanks. Admiral Mitcher ended the prohibition on night flights. On the 4th of December 1943, the real proof came in actual battle. Task Force 38 was carrying out missions close to the Gilbert Islands. Japanese spies had pinpointed where the carrier group was. At 20-30 hours, the radar screens lit up with incoming planes. 12 Mitsubishi G4M Betty torpedo bombers were heading in from the northwest direction. 4 Hellcats that had the new foam in their tanks took off for a night interception. The pilots were Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare, Lieutenant Alex Vrazo, Ensign Warren Scone, and Ensign John Ballantyne. O'Hare took charge of the group as they flew through the completely dark sky. They had no lights on, relying just on radar guidance from the Essex. The Japanese bombers were skimming low over the waves, hoping to stay hidden from detection. At 20:47 hours, O'Hare caught sight of the first Betty, a shadowy form against the even darker sea. He plunged down, fired from 300 yards away. His tracer rounds traced right across the bomber's body. The Betty blew up and tumbled into the water. Vrazo took out the second one. Scone downed the third. Suddenly, the night was filled with streaks of tracers and bursts of flame. The Japanese group scattered in panic, but one Betty's rear gunner managed to hit O'Hare's Hellcat. Shots struck his left wing and the fuel tank there. Fuel poured out from the hole. The self-sealing layer kicked in. It slowed the leak and then sealed it completely. Still, O'Hare had lost 50 gallons. He was low on fuel and turned back toward the Essex. The carrier was rocking in rough waves. O'Hare came in for his approach, dealing with strong winds from the side and almost empty tanks. His wheels hit the deck hard. The tailhook grabbed the wire. That sharp stop sent a huge jolt through his tanks, which were only half full at best. In the days before Sweat's change, O'Hare would have been gone in a flash. His tanks would have burst into flames, just like what happened to Lieutenant Anderson or Lieutenant Edwards. But this time, O'Hare stepped out unscathed. The foam had taken the force of the surge. No vacuum built up. The rubber didn't rip. No spark set anything off. The results from those fights told the whole story. Throughout December of 1943, the carrier groups with night fighters brought down 47 Japanese planes, and not one loss came from a fuel tank blowing up. Come January of 1944, they destroyed 63 more enemy aircraft. Japanese records that were captured later showed how confused they were. Their reports talked about American night fighters that seemed impossible to damage in battle and could keep flying long missions without any breakdowns. Japanese pilots started steering clear of nighttime raids on the carrier groups altogether. The bigger picture was huge. Since night torpedo strikes weren't much of a danger anymore, the American carriers could push forward more boldly. They could get close enough to hit islands held by the Japanese. They could stay in position for days-long operations without pulling back to safer spots once the sun set. The numbers on kills made it clear. Before the foam was added, American pilots had a 19-to-1 advantage in daytime fights, but night missions were stopped because of the explosion risks. After the foam went in, it stayed at 23-to-1 during the day and jumped to 31-to-1 at night. Japanese planes were falling in huge numbers. American losses dropped sharply. By February of 1944, this change was the new standard for every Navy carrier plane. Not only Hellcats, but Corsairs, Avengers, and Helldivers as well. The method of lining tanks with foam spread to bombers and then to transport planes. A report from German Luftwaffe intelligence, found after the war ended, described what the Americans had done. It said the enemy had created a fuel tank setup that made their planes almost impossible to blow up during carrier work. Their own tries to copy it hadn't worked. The report called American advances in technology and safety a major problem for their side. In March of 1944, Lieutenant Alex Vrazo, one of the pilots from that very first night fight, went looking for sweat down in the Essex's maintenance area. Vrazo had just earned ace status with 19 confirmed downs. "I hear you're the one who sorted out the fuel tanks," Vrazo told him. Sweat gave a nod. "I caught some hits last week, right in a fuel tank. Got back to the carrier with barely anything left. Came down hard in the deck and walked away fine." Vrazo held out his hand. "Thanks to you, I'm still here. Thanks to you, a bunch of us are." Sweat shook it, not sure what to say. "How many pilots do you figure you've kept alive?" Vrazo asked. Sweat had never added it up. He was only trying to solve what was breaking. The tale of James Sweat shows us that fresh ideas often come from places no one expects, from folks who look at issues in a different way because they're not stuck in the usual patterns of thought. If these kinds of accounts draw you in, accounts of regular people who altered the path of history, then like this video and pass it along to somebody who values true acts of bravery. Your likes and shares let us keep uncovering these overlooked stories. From November of 1943 through August of 1945, tanks lined with foam stopped an estimated 394 explosions in carrier planes. That means 394 pilots made it back home. 394 families who didn't get that awful knock on the door. 394 men who kept flying, kept taking down enemy planes, kept backing up troops on the ground. The Navy built 12,275 F6F Hellcats in total during the war. Every one made after December of 1943 came with foam-lined tanks, following Sweat's approach. The same change went into 10,000 F4U Corsairs, 9,839 TBF Avengers, and 7,040 SB-2C Helldivers. Altogether, 3,973 planes got this protection. But James Sweat didn't get any spotlight during the war years. The Navy kept the foam lining method secret, worried that if the Japanese figured it out, they'd find ways to counter it. You won't find Sweat's name in any official records put out before 1990. He got bumped up to Chief Petty Officer in January of 1944. He stayed aboard the Essex right until the war wrapped up, fixing planes, teaching newer mechanics, and quietly adding tweaks that kept people safe. When fellow sailors asked about his part in fixing the tanks, he'd brush it off. "Plenty of us worked it out," he'd say. "I just got fortunate." Once the war was over, Sweat headed back to Terre Haute. He started up a little garage for car repairs. He married his old high school love, Mary Catherine Sullivan. They had 4 kids together. He hardly ever mentioned his time in the Navy. His own children didn't learn about what he'd done to save so many pilots until a Navy researcher found him in 1991. The idea Sweat came up with for lining fuel tanks with foam is still in use now. Today's planes, both military and commercial, have foam baffles inside tanks to stop explosions and crashes. The Federal Aviation Administration requires systems that suppress explosions using foam in the fuel tanks of passenger jets. Even Formula One race cars use something similar. Whenever you get on a commercial flight, you're safer because of a system that started with a 24-year-old mechanic who wouldn't let good men die for no reason. In 1993, the Navy finally gave Sweat the Legion of Merit, 48 years after the fact. The words on it said, "For exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services and achievements whose innovation in fuel system safety directly resulted in the preservation of hundreds of lives and contributed significantly to the success of naval aviation operations in the Pacific Theater." Sweat went to the event at the Pentagon. He was 74 then. When the press asked how it felt to get the honor at last, he replied, "I was only doing my duty." The true heroes are those pilots who went out on the missions. I just helped make sure they could return. James Sweat passed away in 2009 at the age of 90. His notice in the Terre Haute Tribune-Star brought up his Navy days in the very last paragraph. Most folks who read it had no clue that the quiet guy who'd worked on their cars for 50 years had kept hundreds of lives from ending too soon. What James Sweat's life teaches isn't about being a genius or having fancy degrees or years of school. It's about looking at troubles straight on, finding the guts to do something, and knowing that now and then, the biggest breakthroughs come from people who aren't meant to have the solutions, but who won't accept that there aren't any. Now and then, the one who turns everything around is the person nobody saw coming. Now and then, the answer is straightforward. And now and then, going against the rules is the only path to keeping people alive. The Bureau of Aeronautics got word back almost immediately. Captain Ralph Waller's urgent report that an ordinary enlisted mechanic might have cracked the riddle of the fuel tank blasts landed at the desk of Admiral John McCain, the man in charge of Task Force 38. McCain wasted no time and ordered full-scale testing without delay. The very next day, the 14th of November 1943, the crew aboard the USS Essex carried out carefully supervised experiments. They modified 6 Hellcats by lining their fuel tanks with a foam. Another 6 planes kept their standard tanks to serve as comparisons. Each one of those 12 aircraft went through 10 full arrested landings. The pilots varied the amount of fuel left in the tanks, changed up their approach speeds, and dealt with different conditions out on the open sea. They deliberately pushed things to the edge, coming in with hard thuds, catching wires off to the side, and experiencing the maximum possible sudden stops. The findings left no room for doubt. Not one single explosion happened in any of the planes equipped with the foam-lined tanks. But in the group without the modification, 2 planes blew up during the tests. Even with those clear results, many in the Navy's upper ranks stayed cautious and unconvinced. Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman, who oversaw the development of carrier-based aviation, personally flew out to the Essex so he could question Sweat face to face. "You're seriously telling me that 50 highly trained engineers with degrees from places like MIT completely missed what a young man from an Indiana farm managed to spot?" "Sir, I'm not a trained engineer at all," Sweat replied. "And perhaps that's exactly why it stood out to me. I wasn't lost in complex calculations and theories. I was staring right at the damaged wreckage and seeing what it was telling me." Sherman spent time going over the detailed test records. He sat down with the pilots who had flown those trials. He carefully examined the way the foam had been installed inside the tanks. In the end, he asked the one question that truly counted. What kind of real-world effects would this have on day-to-day operations? Things like the extra weight, how the plane handles in the air, and the ongoing maintenance needs. Sweat was ready with straightforward answers. "It adds about 5 pounds to each tank, sir. That's hardly worth noticing. The flight tests showed no change whatsoever in performance. We can install it on a plane in roughly 45 minutes, and the materials themselves cost around $8. After hearing that, Sherman made up his mind on the spot. We're going to put this into effect across the entire fleet. Within the next 2 weeks, every single Hellcat operating in the Pacific will receive this update. Of course, a major obstacle popped up right away. The Navy simply did not have anywhere near enough foam rubber on hand. That material was already in high demand and short supply, with most of it going toward making life jackets and other flotation devices for the crews. Sherman immediately commandeered every available pound of suitable foam anywhere in the Pacific theater. Still, it wasn't nearly sufficient. Then, somebody came up with a practical suggestion. Use the foam from mattresses. Practically every ship carried hundreds of them aboard. If the sailors treated that mattress foam with a fire-retardant chemical, it would do the job perfectly. In just 72 hours, men all over the Pacific Fleet were busily cutting apart their own mattresses. They ended up sleeping on nothing but bare metal springs and bunks, all so that the foam could go toward keeping pilots alive. Not a soul complained about it. By that point, nearly everyone had a friend, a shipmate, or someone they knew who had perished in one of those terrifying fuel tank fires. This massive retrofit effort turned into the swiftest modification program for aircraft that the Navy had ever seen. By the 30th of November 1943, well over 800 Hellcats were flying with the new, foam-lined fuel tanks. Admiral Mitcher, feeling confident in the fix, officially lifted the long-standing ban on all nighttime flight operations. Just a few days later, on the 4th of December 1943, the modification faced its first true test in the heat of combat. Task Force 38 was conducting strikes in the vicinity of the Gilbert Islands. Japanese forces had managed to pinpoint the location of the American carrier group. At 20:30 hours that evening, radar operators detected incoming threats. 12 Mitsubishi G4M Betty torpedo bombers were closing in fast from the northwest. 4 Hellcats fitted with the foam modifications scrambled into the air for a nighttime interception mission. Leading them was Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare, alongside Lieutenant Alex Vraso, Ensign Warren Scone, and Ensign John Ballantyne. O'Hare guided the small formation through the pitch-black night sky. They flew without any running lights, depending entirely on radar directions piped in from the Essex. The enemy bombers were hugging the waves at very low altitude, attempting to slip under radar coverage. Then, at 20:47 hours, O'Hare visually spotted the lead Betty, just a faint silhouette against the darker ocean below. He dove straight in and opened fire from a range of 300 yards. His glowing tracer rounds stitched right across the bomber's fuselage. The Betty erupted in a massive explosion and spun wildly into the sea. Vraso quickly claimed the second bomber. Scone took down the third. In moments, the darkness lit up with criss-crossing tracers and bright flashes of detonating aircraft. The Japanese formation fell into complete disarray. But during the chaos, the tail gunner on one Betty scored several hits on O'Hare's Hellcat. Rounds slammed into his port wing and directly into one fuel tank. Fuel began streaming out from the punctures. Thankfully, the self-sealing rubber lining performed exactly as designed. The flow slowed and eventually stopped altogether. Even so, O'Hare had already lost around 50 gallons of fuel. He was dangerously low and immediately turned back toward the Essex. The carrier was heaving and pitching in heavy swells. O'Hare lined up his approach while battling gusty crosswinds and with his tanks nearly empty. His wheels struck the deck with force. The tailhook snagged the wire, and the abrupt halt sent a tremendous surge through his half-empty fuel tanks. Before James Sweat's innovative fix, that violent stop would have meant certain death for O'Hare. His tanks would have exploded in flames, just like so many others before him. pilots like Lieutenant Anderson or Lieutenant Edwards. This time, though, O'Hare climbed out of the cockpit completely unharmed. The foam had cushioned and absorbed the sudden shift of fuel. No vacuum had formed inside the tank. The rubber lining stayed intact with no tears, and crucially, no static spark ever ignited anything. The outcomes from actual battles made the value of the change impossible to argue against. All through December of 1943, carrier groups equipped with night-capable fighters shot down 47 Japanese aircraft. Remarkably, none of those successes came at the cost of even one American loss due to a fuel tank explosion. By January of 1944, that tally climbed to 63 enemy planes destroyed. Captured Japanese documents later revealed their growing bewilderment and frustration. Their own intelligence described American night fighters as seemingly impervious to battle damage and able to fly extended missions without suffering mechanical failures. As a result, Japanese pilots increasingly refused to attempt nighttime assaults on the American carrier forces. The broader strategic advantages were immense. With the constant danger of attacks after dark greatly reduced, U.S. carrier groups could advance more aggressively across the Pacific. They could move in close enough to launch strikes against islands occupied by Japanese troops. They could hold their positions for operations that lasted several days without needing to withdraw to distant, safer waters once night fell. The sheer numbers of aerial victories drove the point home. Prior to the foam lining, American pilots enjoyed a 19-to-1 kill ratio during daylight engagements, though night operations remained grounded because of the explosion dangers. Once the foam was in place, the daytime ratio improved slightly to 23-to-1, while nighttime fights soared to an astonishing 31-to-1 advantage. Japanese aircraft losses mounted rapidly. American pilot losses, on the other hand, fell dramatically. By February of 1944, the foam lining technique had become mandatory equipment on every type of carrier-based aircraft in the Navy. Not just the Hellcats, but also Corsairs, Avengers, and Helldivers. The same basic approach was soon adapted for use in bomber fuel tanks and later in transport planes as well. A post-war intelligence report from the German Luftwaffe, captured and translated, openly acknowledged the American breakthrough. It stated that the enemy had engineered a fuel tank system that made their aircraft virtually immune to explosions during the stresses of carrier operations. German efforts to duplicate the technology had failed completely. The report concluded that this American edge in technical innovation and aviation safety created a serious strategic handicap for Axis forces. In March of 1944, Lieutenant Alex Vrazo, one of the pilots who flew that groundbreaking first-night combat mission, made a point of seeking out sweat in the maintenance spaces aboard the Essex. By then, Vrazo had achieved ace status with 19 confirmed victories. "Word is, you're the fellow who solved the fuel tank nightmare," Vrazo said. Sweat simply nodded. "Not long ago, I took direct hits right in a tank. I limped back to the carrier with almost nothing left in the gauges, landed hard on a rolling deck, and walked away without a mark." Vrazo reached out his hand. "Because of what you did, I'm still breathing. Because of you, a whole lot of us are." Sweat shook the offered hand, searching for words. "How many pilots do you reckon you've saved over time?" Vrazo pressed. Sweat had never tried to count. He had only been focused on stopping something that was needlessly killing good men. James Sweat's journey reminds everyone that true breakthroughs frequently emerge from the most unlikely sources, from individuals who view challenges through fresh eyes simply because they aren't bound by established ways of thinking. If accounts of this sort captivate you, narratives about everyday individuals who profoundly altered the course of history, then please like this presentation and share it with anyone who truly appreciates stories of genuine heroism. Your engagement helps keep these long-forgotten tales alive and reaching new audiences. Looking at the full span from November of 1943 all the way to August of 1945, the presence of foam-lined fuel tanks is estimated to have prevented 394 explosions in carrier-based aircraft. That translates to 394 pilots who returned safely to their ships. 394 families who never received the heartbreaking news of a loved one's death. 394 skilled aviators who lived to fly additional sorties, claim more enemy aircraft, and provide vital support to troops fighting on the ground. In total, the Navy manufactured 12,275 F6F Hellcats throughout the war years. Every single one produced after December of 1943 incorporated foam-lined fuel tanks directly inspired by Sweat's discovery. The same protective measure was rolled out across 10,000 F4U Corsairs, 9,839 TBF Avengers, and 7,040 SB-2C Helldivers. When added together, that meant 3,973 aircraft received this life-saving upgrade. Yet, during the war itself, James Sweat received no widespread acclaim or public acknowledgement. The Navy deliberately kept the details of the foam lining method classified as confidential. They feared that if the Japanese learned the specifics, they might devise effective countermeasures. As a result, Sweat's name does not appear in any publicly released official histories until well after 1990. He did earn a promotion to Chief Petty Officer in January of 1944. He continued serving aboard the Essex until the war's conclusion, repairing aircraft, mentoring younger mechanics, and quietly introducing small enhancements that continued to preserve lives. Whenever other crew members inquired about his involvement in resolving the fuel tank crisis, he always downplayed it. "A bunch of us contributed ideas," he would say modestly. "I was just the one who happened to be in the right place at the right time." When peace finally arrived, Sweat made his way back home to Terre Haute, Indiana. He established a modest automobile repair garage. He married Mary Catherine Sullivan, the girl he had loved since high school. Together, they built a family with 4 children. He rarely, if ever, spoke about his experiences in the Navy. Even his own kids remained unaware of the extraordinary role he had played in saving countless pilots, until a dedicated Navy historian finally located him in 1991. The core principle that Sweat pioneered, using foam to line fuel tanks, remains in active service to this very day. Contemporary aircraft, whether military or civilian, incorporate foam baffles within their tanks to greatly reduce the risk of explosions following impacts or crashes. The Federal Aviation Administration now requires explosion suppression systems based on foam technology in the fuel tanks of all commercial airliners. Similar materials protect Formula One racing cars as well. Every single time you step aboard a modern passenger jet, your safety benefits from a lineage of protection that traces straight back to the insight of a 24-year-old mechanic who simply could not stand by while brave men died unnecessarily. In 1993, the Navy, at long last, presented Sweat with the Legion of Merit, an honor delayed by 48 years. The formal citation praised him for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services and achievements, whose innovation in fuel system safety directly resulted in the preservation of hundreds of lives and contributed significantly to the success of naval aviation operations in the Pacific theater. Sweat, then 74 years old, traveled to the Pentagon to accept the award in person. When members of the press asked how it felt to receive recognition after so many decades, he answered quietly, "I was merely carrying out my responsibilities. The genuine heroes are the pilots who courageously flew those dangerous missions. I only helped ensure they had a fair chance to make it back home." James Sweat passed away in 2009, having reached the age of 90. His obituary, published in the Terre Haute Tribune Star, briefly noted his naval service near the very end. The majority of readers had no inkling that the unassuming local mechanic, who had reliably serviced their vehicles for half a century, had quietly saved hundreds of lives during the war. The enduring legacy of James Sweat's story lies not in advanced intellect, prestigious credentials, or extensive formal education. It lies in the ability to observe problems with clear vision, to summon the bravery needed to take action, and to recognize that the most transformative ideas sometimes arise from those who are never expected to provide answers, yet who steadfastly refuse to believe that viable answers do not exist. From time to time, the individual who reshapes the world is precisely the one no one anticipated. From time to time, the most effective solution turns out to be remarkably simple. And from time to time, bending or even breaking established rules becomes the only true way to protect and preserve human lives.